So Lisa, with that, do you want to help set some of the framing for what we're going to do today?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And not lost on me that we do when we come a long way. Getting some video for these parts.
You keep dropping out, Lisa.
Oh, sorry. Is that better?
Sure.
Talk right into my phone.
There you go.
Okay. So I appreciate everybody being here. We've got a pretty important task on this, and a lot of students from the state are also tackling the idea of STEM and definition and all those things. So it's important that we draw everything together, and that's the act of the subcommittee. I believe there's a lot of folks in the room who have some real first-hand knowledge of what's happening in the data and the metrics, and I think that's very important. We certainly couldn't pull this together without you. And then one of the things that I wanted to say as we talk through this is as we start to frame out what this committee is going to accomplish. I think that's really the ultimate goal of today, is to follow up from the first meet and greet that we did that I was stuck on a plane for, but really to leave this today with the idea of what the plan is, what we're trying to accomplish. So that's really the goal of today's meeting. And part of that timing as far as our STEM hub, who are going to looking for additional funding next year, as well as new STEM hubs. So there's a lot of there that they're looking for the sector that, and this calls this committee to have guidance there. So, Mark, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, not at this time. Thank you, Lisa. We did start a little bit of that at our last meeting and really determined that we needed to come back here and first and foremost, given the charge of the STEM Investment Council to double the number of STEM degrees and certificates, as well as double the math and science achievement scores for students at 4th and 8th grade, that we really needed to first better understand and wrestle with the question of what do we mean by the STEM jobs and degrees and certificates, and then knowing that we also have some work going on at the HEC that and in other places about finding incentives to increase, to align those degrees and certificates with high wage, high demand jobs. So we need to also be better understanding what do we mean by those STEM jobs and how we are going to actually think about aligning those. So there's a number of different aspects here that we need to do, and people across the country have been wrestling with this same way of trying to get at those definitions. So in addition to sort of setting ourselves a bit of a timetable here, then going into the, what's the latest on the definitions, and then who are we going to actually, what is the process by vetting those recommendations and coming back and then establishing those with the STEM Council. Okay.
The only thing I would add is, this is a pretty important piece of the work, because the governor's allocated dollars in his budget towards STEM, and there's about $21 million in total in his budget to support the advancement of STEM. And I think one of the things we have to be able to demonstrate is we're getting the outcomes that the citizens of Oregon expect out of this effort. And so the metrics are a way to measure that and really see that we're getting the right outcomes and we're on the right path. So, we can put plans in place, we can talk all about plans, but at the end of the day, we're really about outcomes. And the metrics will help us, guide us, and this is not a one-year fix-it. This is a long-term journey. I think we all understand that, but having clear metrics at all levels to be able to measure the impact of what we are doing and see the changes over time are critical. So as we put these metrics together to measure those outcomes, it's really critical that we think about not only short and long-term metrics to do that, so we can show in the short term we're making progress, but ultimately in the long term we're trying to produce better outcomes for our students. And that's really an important part of this. So encouraging, we still have to go through the legislative effort. There's been a CTE STEM Employers Coalition that's put together from the business community side to really support the funding of this effort. In total, There's also money being allocated, being recommended for career technical education, and maybe those will ultimately come together in one place. And though this effort right now is focused at STEM, it could easily be broadened to include CTE. And as Mark and I have discussed, it's really a continuum between CTE and STEM. It's just part of the journey a student goes through, and we may ultimately have to kind of capture that also. But right now, our focus is really on STEM degrees. But clearly, CTE is part of the STEM education process, and there's a real nexus there. So, encouraged about what we're doing. I think we've got good progress to date, and I think we've got some good things to talk about today's meeting. So, I'm anxious to get into it.
Can I have 2 minutes? I'm
Sure.
going to change phones over.
Okay.
This is a much better one. So she's going to have to call back in about 2 minutes, 1 minute after I get it.
Okay.
set up.
Did you hear that, Lisa? You're going to call back in 1 minute as soon as you get disconnected.
I did, no problem.
Okay.
We got your back phone.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah. We talked about at the last meeting, actually, a couple of the deliverables.
Welcome to the teleconference service. Please enter your access.
I'd probably wait.
You should probably wait.
I should probably wait, so Lisa knows.
There are 3 participants on the call, including you. You are joining your conference as the host. For a menu of available commands, press *#.
Mute the computer.
Very sci-fi.
You can just select the
Let's see. One of the outcomes is to be able to communicate. Off floor of that, folks.
Constant communication of.
Well,
Hey, Mark, I'm back.
Oh, good.
In the 12.
yeah. You're back?
I'm here.
Okay.
Oh.
Great. We hear you perfectly now.
Perfect, thank you very much.
Oh, my. Oh, that's so much better.
Oh, good. Yeah, it's always awkward to be out of the room. It's worse if you can't be heard.
Yeah. So, Lisa, I was just, in the transition, I was starting to say some of the deliverables that we've already put forward. You know, certainly creating the definitions is a critical piece of a deliverable. When do we want to have that done is something that we want to have a conversation about today. The other is to determine the metrics that we are going to be looking at. You know, what are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve across the birth to career continuum for STEM in the state? And as I mentioned last time, there's already some work that is being done with the STEM hubs to create a shared outcomes framework that then links to, you know, so they're providing information about what they're doing, and that will link to both the strategic planning and the work of this committee. Okay, so we're not trying to say this committee is the be-all, end-all. There's a lot of other work that's already established to get input. So we felt that we needed to move forward on that in order to get information to this committee to then respond to and feed back. So there's going to be a real learning process here of feeding information and back and forward to actually determine those final outcomes. We have set a deliverable timeline to get to the STEM Investment Council for approval in the May-June time frame, at least for a draft, and then to be presenting then to the OEIB in the June-July timing on that. Okay, so starting with the new biennium, we should be ready to roll. We'll see, because I think that this is going to be an iterative process, and I don't think that we should be setting ourselves up for perfection, but let's set ourselves up to be at least a good 80 to 90% there toward what we think are sensible outcomes, and then we're going to be sitting with those and looking at and assessing annually, are those the ones that are really telling us about what we need to know in the system, and if they're not, then we're going to need to change those. But we need to start somewhere, and so that's the idea for this particular group.
That makes sense, Mark. And along those lines, it's the idea of what are the metrics themselves and the outcomes and what are the leading indicators. And I know that when I was sitting in with the Central Oregon STEM Hub recently, listening to them basically take some of the shared outcomes framework that I know we're going to get to and try to hone in on, for this region, what were important metrics and then what were the measurable outcomes versus things that were more of a tactic or strategy to achieve those. And so there was some debates over what was an outcome and what was a tactic or an indicator. And so I think some of our work here will help give some clarity on that can then influence some of the hub's thinking and vice versa. They'll influence how we're thinking.
Yeah, and we can say more a little bit on that when we get to what Chrissy's going to share with us around those shared outcomes, because some of those are things that we should be seeing, from a field perspective. They need to see results within, what's going to change within a year or two, or what is going to change in 5+ years, and we need to have a good sense of where that locus of control sits, while also setting an aspirational target of where we want these things to be stacking and logically connected to the broader, longer term outcomes that we're seeking. So, great.
So where we go? What's next on the agenda?
So next on the, did anyone have any questions around that? Okay, so let's when we start to look at defining STEM jobs, degrees, and certificates, let's look at the specific timeline and processes for how we go about that work. I sent around to the committee a couple of things. One, some definitions that have come out of Change the Equation, which is a national association or organization that is really doing some excellent work in connecting across multiple states. And they put forward some definitions around what is a STEM job. And I sent the highlighted list around to you in an Excel spreadsheet based on the standard occupation codes. And I believe that these are ones that Brenda and I have talked about pretty much. The majority of those were in our definitions with the data that she had shared, with some exceptions in the healthcare industry. Did anyone have some responses to that or thoughts on what was sent around?
Given that we think we're going to have a demand problem filling teacher slots, maybe we ought to add some teachers in there. I mean, I don't think the state level data supports that as a high demand, but we're getting reports from the field that they can't find the CTE teacher, they can't find the math teacher.
So are you saying in terms of defining it as a STEM position or in terms
that
of
is
a high demand
interest,
job?
That is a STEM position that is of interest to this committee.
So I'd jump over to the thing that you passed around after that, which is this Brookings piece, which I think is phenomenal. It does what you'd want to do. You go into the ONET and sort of see different degrees of STEM within that work. And I think it would pick up teachers, a host of teachers. There's all kinds of things in that other highlighted report where you could just go through and say, budget analyst, welder, they all have different degrees of STEM need, and I think that's what this report just does in an amazingly elegant way. So
it builds an infrastructure,
yeah,
which is very enticing. I like your book.
So I love this, and if there's a technical way to implement it.
And my question is, are these codes standard across the U.S.? I mean, these things are standard, can be measured, they come through the university system and things like that? So are they trackable?
Two things. We've got ones that are defining occupations, and there's two primary data sources for that. There's the SOC code, Standard Occupation Codes, and then there's the ONET database. And Brenda, can you tell us sort of how those fit? But before you do, then the other piece is around the classifications of instructional programs defining the degrees. So I think we need to treat these right now. We need to treat them, talk about them separately, but they certainly need to be interrelated. So let's stick with the jobs right now and then move toward.
And all of the taxonomies are set at the federal level, so they're tractable.
Yes.
Track
Across,
That's how to
yep.
make sure these are national codes.
So the SOC and the ONET are both occupational classifications. The SOC has about 820, I think, occupations. ONET has about 1,100, I think. And the difference is ONET's more detailed. It still has those same 800, but then it breaks some out into more detail.
And as I understand it, the ONET actually talks about the necessary requirements to be successful in those particular jobs, the educational background. And, I mean, go ahead. Maybe that's a fallacious understanding, but tell us more about that.
Well, there's a lot of information that is tied to the ONET occupations that are not tied directly just to the SOC. In ONET, in the system, in the ONET system, there's a lot of information about knowledge and skills and abilities. And I believe the Brookings paper feeds off of the knowledge part. And so that's where it's at.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
So Brookings, so I included Brookings in a grant that I wrote, so I read it quite a bit, or pretty closely, and looked at the data. Brookings pulls selected knowledge statements related to STEM out and then classifies the amount of use by occupation, and that's how that is generated. And so it's a pretty thoughtful methodology, I think. And so it does go back, and it does go back to that core federal definition of what constitutes an occupation.
Is it something? I mean, I skimmed it, so I don't know all of the ins and outs. But is it something that we could just pull and apply to our codes now without a whole bunch of extra analyses, or do we have to actually do some of the analyses they do on like our classified jobs? But if we're all sharing that, can't we just pull from this potentially?
I think there'd be analyst work
Okay.
involved, but I don't think it would be redefining the occupations. And there's certainly, I would assume, be extension of that analyst work, such as embedding in what we consider high demand and high wage, because the local labor market, the national labor market is sort of a fictitious concept, and it's really only becomes real when it gets down to the local level. So there'd be analyst work on that end. But in terms of amount or time, you've got a good foundation already in place.
My feeling also, just given the way we are heading as a state, with the understanding that there is a lot of fuzziness around the 40-40-20, that these are not absolutes, that there is not an absolute sort of sort of traditional way of looking at STEM is an all on or all off based on a title. All of the SOC code analytics from the National Science Foundation, from the Department of Labor, from the Homeland Security, that list that I sent out, this one up here, is really looking at titles and somebody going, yeah, well, okay. And it doesn't have as much information to it. So I am very impressed by the Brookings report. So I think that the key questions are, or one of the questions is, what work would be needed to implement this approach from a systems perspective? Are there challenges for us, to be pulling that kind of data for us as a state? But otherwise, I would be interested in hearing other people's impressions about whether there's a downside with using the Brookings, because there's so much upside, particularly with this merger of the career and technical education side, the trades. One of the things that the Brookings report does is it does a couple of things. Right off the bat, it says, one, instead of saying something like 10 or 11% of all jobs in the U.S. are STEM jobs. They're estimating 20% of all jobs being STEM jobs because of the high degree of knowledge required in at least one or more STEM fields. They're saying that that half of all of those STEM jobs are without a 4-year degree. So to me, that actually is a much better reflection of the reality out there. Certainly software engineers don't, by and large, require a STEM degree, and oftentimes don't even require a high school degree to be successful in those fields. And this would enable us to capture it.
Do you know, is there a section in here, I'm wondering if you did an overlap, like, so we have this list and what's been classified, and then if you do this analysis, what actually drops out or what is included, so that could actually guide you and you say, oh, this methodology dropped out these 10 things, but we actually think those are sort of important, and then vice versa. Might be an interesting way to think about limitations
You
of the
could.
methodology.
You could do the SOC crosswalk. A piece of information I think would be interesting is, if we have time and the resources, the Brookings report claims that one of the benefits of pulling out these occupations as STEM is that on average they pay 10% higher wages than other occupations that require that same level of educational background. And I don't know what that looks like in Oregon. And that might be an interesting thing in terms of our justification for adopting it or not adopting it, to see whether or not that wage increase holds true for our environment. I don't know if that would be, I don't know if you guys have the resources, what that would look like.
So, I mean, my sense in terms of the way that this thing works is that their hard work was to go through all those ONET codes by occupation. And they did that in some sophisticated, some detailed, foundation-funded exercise to do that. That work, I think, translates to any state or region, because that's, an occupation's an occupation. And you would take those findings and plug them into the employment department's understanding of where our occupations are today and where our occupations are going. But that core analysis that Brookings did wouldn't change.
Right.
It would say, at this point in time, our understanding is this occupation is either a high STEM occupation or a super STEM occupation.
Isn't that a nice break?
Yeah, I like that too, yeah.
Yeah, and so I mean, there's certainly work to be done. I think it's work that it would be extremely valuable for the state to engage in, but I don't think it would, I think a first impactful step would not be a huge lift. It would be sort of coordinating with getting whatever data appendices these folks have, maybe from them directly, plugging it in.
It's online. If you
It's
go to
okay.
their site, you just
Is it?
download it. It's Excel spreadsheets.
Oh, wow, okay.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all accessible.
And they've done some work already on the state data, but I think we would want to check their figures on that through our own employment.
And I think then, to your point, it would be, did you agree with that original? You probably wouldn't want to then go back and look at the output and sort of, if you started picking things out one by one, you drive yourself crazy. But you might want to, there might be something in the original method that either they've reconsidered or somebody else has reconsidered, a specific ONET knowledge that you say they didn't classify as STEM, but and so change it in the beginning methodology and let it flow through, and that would then reveal different occupations. So I think you'd start at that sort of core.
Probably
Yeah.
the place to start is in ag. I would guess that's the one
Yeah.
that's.
Well, actually, they say that in the report, that a significant amount of the jobs that are captured are in the high-tech manufacturing, which we've, again, from our industry folks here are going, these are high-tech jobs. I mean, these are STEM jobs. Agriculture and food processing was captured, and the construction and trades, construction industries, by and large, are often very STEM focused as well. So I think that those are the ones that I recall them picking up that weren't caught in the other
So if
It's
you
got
look
lots
at,
of STEM jobs
Yeah.
in utilities.
Yeah.
In utilities, yes, that's right, the utilities and energy
Forget about
sector.
energy.
Oh, gosh, wow.
Thanks a lot. So if you looked at page 10 of the Brookings, I take it from this data, there are job classifications under each of these categories that
Yes.
summarize up to these numbers. And
Yes.
they would say anything above anything positive on mean STEM score goes into STEM, or does it how far does it go down? Or they think all these are STEM related?
I think.
Where's the cutoff?
They sort of went, so each one of these has like dozens of individual occupations underneath them.
Right?
And then my understanding was they looked at sort of STEM knowledge, and if it was more than, 1.5 standard deviations away from typical, they considered that to be a STEM. So it was literally,
So where would be the cutoff line if you use that criteria? Is it stop where it's 0? I mean, is that, or is it negative? I'm not, I
It's a
understand.
pretty
Yeah.
complex, they rank each of these statements and then they combine them and there's a weight attached. And so it's not, I don't think it's an easy
So they're
A over
saying all of
0.
these
Yeah.
have some STEM in them, basically.
Yeah,
What I think what we probably should do as a step here for this committee is assign a couple, let's find the expertise to review the methodology
Mhm.
and what are the implications of this methodology on our data systems right now.
So, yeah, I'm getting confused, which is not necessarily surprising. I took the phrase defining literally, and one of the things that I liked about the Brookings Institute was it provided a really broad definition that speaks to the education system, which is what we're trying to impact. So my question is, are we seeking to develop a definition in the true sense of a definition? That is, a STEM career is a career that involves this level of knowledge and expertise in these areas of da-da-da-da, as our definition of STEM careers. And then under that, aligning the data that we have access to support whether or not we're making progress towards achieving that definition of STEM career. The advantage of going with the Brookings is that it does speak to the educational needs
Yes.
that we're trying to address to move kids into that pipeline and into a STEM career. So so my question is, are we seeking to really create that definition and then align the data sources that we have? Or are we looking to create a list of categories and jobs and fields and certificates and whatnot?
I'm not sure I understand the distinction of what you're trying to pose here. I think that in my head, if we've got folks who have defined a STEM job and people have tried in multiple ways, and to me the Brookings is very exciting. So if we can adopt that, but before we adopt it, we know the implications of what that would mean. And then, yes, then we align our data, we would work to try to figure out how can we, pull the necessary data to be able to conduct the analysis around that definition.
Yeah, and I guess when I read the Brookings, they provided less of a definition in the sense of a word, of the term definition, and more of an expansion of the concept around.
Yeah, Lisa?
Around
Not Lisa. Minutes. Are you going with her?
Oh, is there other people?
I'm going to put this up on mute.
If there's folks who have joined us on the phone, can you please mute yourself?
And make sure that you help her get the dogs harnessed and stuff.
Somebody talking about a dog, can you please mute yourself? Thank you.
So in my mind, I'm not sure Brookings ever actually, for me anyway, clearly defined STEM. They alluded to it, and they alluded to different pieces of the puzzle, but they never really came out and said, this is it,
Yeah.
right? At least that's how I read it.
I wonder if we can, wrestling with this, I'm not sure without the specific examples. I mean, they did imply with the STEM and super STEM that it required a degree of proficiency and background
STEM-related knowledge.
in STEM-related knowledge,
Right.
and used that as their sort of broad and fuzzy definition,
Yeah.
but then used the specifics of that analysis to then define it. I mean, that became the definition in that way.
I mean, what they're saying to me is the need for STEM knowledge is marbled throughout occupations in every industry to some degree. They're,
Yeah.
you know, agriculture, economic consulting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what they did, I think, was map that marbling through all those different industries, which gets it answers part of the question that I think this group needs to answer, which is if we're going to be pushing kids into more and more acquisition of STEM-related knowledge, will they be able to use it somewhere? And so that's the part that we're trying to answer here is there any demand for it? And I think Brookings is the best illustration of demand for that kind of knowledge that we have a hypothesis is going to be important.
So the way to think about it is you got your STEM occupations, which is your demand curve, and then you got to figure out what your supply curve, and then you back up from that is what are the degrees you need to produce at all levels to meet that demand curve. And I think we're learning there's a whole continuum of skills, but if you broaden the occupations that fit under STEM, then you have a bigger population that indicates that you need certain kinds of educational attainments to fulfill those jobs, and they're different at different levels. So I think this question is really trying to answer, like you said, what is the demand out there so it's clear, we understand where the opportunities are. Then it's a matter of the education system providing the supply side with the various skill sets to meet those occupational demands. So I think that's where, we just want to get the definition of STEM so we're tracking all the right thing. And to your point, STEM is pervasive across many, many industries that we wouldn't think of necessarily being STEM related.
I do think, though, that your point is an important one in terms of potential strength and maybe weakness of adopting Brookings if we were to do so, that methodology, because it broadens the concept of STEM significantly. And there are, for the public, that could be challenging. The grant that we wrote for this had to do with helping students with disabilities access STEM, and this definitely drives it down to the certificate level so that everybody can see how STEM relates to them. Mm-hmm. But that's a whole bigger world than what we've been looking at till now.
Right. And for me, working with students, that could be a huge motivator because now they can see
They can have their own STEM
opportunities
learning.
and stay more engaged in STEM education classes.
Right.
Well, that brings up a question about this knowledge definition. I don't know anything much about this ONET system and how they're defining that. And it looks like they've surveyed people in those positions. And what if the people in the positions don't see themselves as doing science, so they wouldn't answer they're doing that to the level? I just don't know enough about that knowledge category, and if it's something to consider if we don't already know the answer.
Two things I think around that. I think that's a really interesting point, Chrissy. Because if you ask somebody who's in a lumberyard, for example, how much mathematical knowledge do they use all the time? They will say none, or very little. But when you actually analyze what they do in terms of loading the trucks, in terms of thinking through and planning things out, their geospatial reasoning factors, their calculations of board feet, they're using mathematics all of the time, but it may not get captured. But the challenge, I think, for the largest piece for me or concern with the Brookings is that it's still content-based and knowledge-based, and that is fine from a system that values and can measure content knowledge, but a lot of the STEM that we recognize to be successful in STEM is not necessarily the content knowledge, but the dispositions and the mindsets, the 21st century skills, the critical thinking, the problem solving, the curiosity, the communications. That's not captured in this. But that, I think we could balance it. I mean, we've got to start somewhere, right? So as a definition, what we could do is we could do some quick or this committee could say, this is necessary for us to actually define STEM in a way that enables us to access and connect our data systems. And that's good, and we're going to be using that. It doesn't capture, we also value these skill sets, so that we can also be pushing our education system to get at those as well. Is that?
So on what I heard here is Brookings says a STEM job is a job that has significantly more STEM knowledge than the average job. And significance is defined as 1.5 standard deviation.
Yeah.
Right. And, you know, 2 years from now, Brookings may go back and plus this up some way and include.
Needs to be
some
2
of the stuff
standard
we were-
deviations, or
right,
needs to
right.
be
Or-
3/4 of a
Suck in
standard
their
deviation.
spreadsheet.
Put something different in the knowledge section,
Yeah,
or,
but-
yeah.
But I wouldn't
Be
recommend that
rid of-
Oregon, I mean, unless somebody wants to drop a whole
Yeah.
pile of cash on somebody here to
To
try
define
to
it.
fix
There
that
are better
whole
ways to
analysis.
spend the
Yeah, I
pile
know,
of cash.
exactly.
Close enough for what we're
Yeah,
trying to start.
Is this close enough, and can we accept it and adopt it? And if so, what are the implications for us?
But again,
in what it
that
doesn't.
defines the jobs,
Yep.
basically, and then you gotta back up, and how do you fill those jobs? And what are the myriad of skills in
Yeah.
various those areas? Because there's a continuum. Some people in the lumberyard don't need algebra, maybe they need algebra, they don't need calculus, you know, so there's a continuation of where they fall on that curve. As for our linemen, Math 100 is sufficient for them to qualify and do their work.
Yeah.
So there's that continuum.
Well, it sounds like prior to adopting anything, it's just that exploratory analysis and actually doing
Yeah.
some of it to see what pops
So,
out.
so John, you did a study, you said there was like, I can't remember, 35 or 70,000 STEM jobs in 10 years.
Right, I mean, that was just straight off of
And
the employment.
how does
market.
that match with how this would define the number of STEM jobs?
This would be broader.
This would be
It's a
broader and
lot
larger.
more. I actually, Laura reminded me that a couple years ago when this report came out, I was actually asked to look at it, and I'd forgotten, but I pulled it up. But she had to look at it more recently than I did, so anyway. So I actually pulled up the email that I had sent a long time ago, and what did I say about this thing?
You were supposed to have destroyed that email.
I did say at that time that it feels like this is trying to make a STEM as big as we want it to be, because it was going so big. And then I also found a spreadsheet where I took our STEM list at the time, which didn't include healthcare, I don't remember.
Right. Yeah.
And compared it. And as I scroll down my little list here, there's a whole lot more occupations. I mean, yeah, there's a whole lot more occupations on the list than.
Well, I think that's good, because I think that's how you keep students, there's a continuum. And from the student's perspective, it's not just going to be an engineer, maybe working as a lineman or some other job, but still needs STEM qualifications and knowledge, so.
Want to support that engineer
Yeah.
to get
Yeah.
that path.
Exactly,
you know?
it's a team effort, you gotta have that, so.
Well, if somebody came and said 20% of the occupations in the country today require some pretty significant understanding of science, technology, education, math, that doesn't, or engineering and math, that doesn't strike me as a crazy high number.
Yeah.
Right?
But I think-
You watch the retail clerk debugging the point of sale system, like,
Well, yeah, right. Increasingly, because
yeah.
Yeah.
the other retail
technology
clerks
there.
have been replaced by software.
Yeah.
So the ones that are left increasingly have to,
That's the other thing I was gonna mention, is as occupations change, what is, you know, I don't know enough about ONED and these reports, is like, they're using more and more, so I know I see this is from 2011. Anyways, so what's the
Very much
catch up
data.
with that?
Do you want to describe
well, I think that, so ONED has to update and stay in touch because, you know, a bank teller today has got to be much sharper than the bank teller 30 years ago. Because most of the bank tellers have been replaced by ATMs, and the ones that are left have to do much more sophisticated work than the typical bank teller of 1980 before the ATM is.
Right.
So back to the demand, you did your study, you kind of looked at STEM degrees on a kind of very high filter, came up, I think,
Right.
70,000 jobs in
Right.
10 years, including the healthcare profession. if you use the ONET, I suspect that number would potentially double, potentially, I don't know.
Brenda.
Yeah.
I can tell you in a minute. if
Okay,
want
so
to.
you. But I think that's,
Analysis on the
but
fly.
I think that's important because it does communicate.
She's remote desktop.
It does communicate to the children out there and the students that there are a lot of jobs that
Yep.
require this kind of training. Now,
Right.
we got to figure out how to give them the right training, but it says there are many, many dimensions of this training. It's not just these high-level jobs, it's the continuum of jobs. To set the expectation, there are a lot of jobs out there that require this just to qualify, and I think that's important. So.
Well, and I love what you
And
said,
the
Laura,
skills
about
are
the
broadly
identity
applicable,
Yeah.
so,
Because
right?
you can see yourself, it's not,
Broadening, well,
yeah.
broadening your ideas about what STEM is, which is part of the point.
Yeah, and Mark
And-
talked about STEM identity a lot.
Yeah, yeah. Chair, in the interest of time, I'm wondering if we could, one, I want to circle back to Jerian's question, but should we assign, a couple of individuals to do a deeper dive into the implications of Brookings and to come back to the subcommittee, with a recommendation of whether or not to adopt it? I'm hearing that that's the most promising way forward, at least in terms of job careers, of STEM jobs and careers.
I like that.
Yeah, I think the proposal is right on mark. In particular, I like the Brookings because it focuses on not just 4 year. It looks at the continuum. And there's a big, badging certificates, community colleges. So I think your suggestion is great. It would be fantastic at our next meeting to have a report from a couple of folks on this and their recommendations. So.
And then I do want to, before sort of going through some of the questions that such a small group would be addressing, Jerry, in terms of, you had something deeper that I'm not catching, I think, in terms of the defining of STEM and the need for something much more specific.
Well, I guess I'm thinking about it from different levels. It's like if we're going to put forth a definition of STEM to collect data around, to show progress of what we're trying to impact, then I think we need a definition that can be floated in front of the public that people would understand and gravitate towards. So that when we talk about STEM and what it means to have a STEM job,
You're not handing them a list of 800 socks.
Yeah.
right, or
Right.
standard deviations of 1.5,
Right.
or something like
Right.
that, because that
understand.
to me it's like if we're really wanting to impact the outcomes of kids and getting them engaged in STEM education so that they then end up in these jobs that are listed on these spreadsheets, then we need to be clear about what our message is.
Right.
And that message is going to end up defining the scope of what we really want to look at. And so I appreciate your advocacy around including that idea of STEM literacy,
Yeah.
so that we can still get kids into those experiences of developing critical thinking skills and appreciation of how you look at the world. But they may have no desire to become whatever level of STEM professional that we define as a STEM job career.
I think the interesting part here too is that we are kind of going in CTE STEM, I hate to say it, but a lot of those jobs in that lower level need those math and science skills, but they may be considered CTE professions like a welder, like a utility worker. So there is that continuum, so be able to communicate that whole continuum and the need for aligning STEM education type experiences to allow children to play any place in that continuum is really important. So.
Yeah. So, I think how we message this is going to be really important, but it may not actually go into how we're defining a STEM job in terms of significantly more math, science, engineering and technology skills than other occupations. So we'll probably message more around the high wage, high demand jobs that are available here in Oregon and how those align to it. And we'll use the definition in terms of comparisons and other arguments, but I think it needs to rest alongside of these other, the STEM literacy for all, not just to fill a particular job. So I think that's going to be part of our communications and advocacy subcommittee work as well, and this is what I told the strategic planning yesterday, because they started going into messaging around it. It's like, well, yes, we're creating a manifesto, but we don't need to boil it down to 3 bullet points and an elevator speech. This is a manifesto, right? This is going to be something that you don't want to boil down into 3 talking points.
So my sense is this is at least the sort of the first round technical answer, and then the question is how do you communicate that? And it's more of a communications challenge than it is a, and what you could imagine a number of different ways of doing it. You could choose a half a dozen occupations out of this that surprise people. You know, here's what you used to think of STEM, the engineer, the doctor, etc. How about the person that goes out and welds together sprinklers on a big farm?
Yeah.
Who has to use math and all this other kind of stuff. Pick sort of 6 surprising
Cases,
Yeah, that would be great.
occupations.
I'm STEM.
I'm STEM. Yeah.
Yes, we are STEM.
And you could, I
I
mean,
am
with Brenda's numbers,
I am STEM.
you could go by county and say, here's how many, by this definition, STEM occupations are sitting in Malheur County, here's how many are sitting in Grant County. And yet there is no Hewlett-Packard, there is no
Well,
whatever.
you gotta think about the continuum though. I mean, there are
Yeah.
people at the lower levels who have basic math and science skills, to up to the higher level, the super ones, the super STEM people that are the engineers and the scientists that are at the far end. There's that whole continuum. We don't wanna diminish the value of STEM, we also wanna show the whole continuum of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think we as a subcommittee need, and OEIB needs kind of an operational definition. That could very well be a STEM job is any job that utilizes a standard deviation of 1.5.
You gotta do the math. You gotta do the math and the science.
You're presenting to the OEIB. That would be great. No, they're going to go. Whoa! I can see Dick.
Right, but see, that's my point, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's my point.
That's right. We do need an operational
Right,
definition.
we need an operational
Yep.
definition to pull those
Yep.
examples
Right,
that
we
have
do.
meaning
Yeah.
to the
Okay.
community.
Yeah.
Fantastic. You're right.
Right?
We do.
So yes, it is a messaging communication issue, and it's an operational
Yeah.
issue as
Gotta
well.
measure, we gotta measure outcomes and results, so.
Yeah.
We gotta have a metric,
Okay.
so.
So who would like to be volunteered for this the smaller group to just come to do a deep dive? Who has the interest and time bandwidth to do a deeper dive into this and
Specific product.
the specific product is to take a closer look at the methodology. Is it as sound as we anticipate it is? What is their operational definition for STEM in 2 sentences? And what doesn't get considered in terms of communicating this? So what might be left out from this definition? Not in terms of the jobs, but in terms of the other STEM literacy skills, that are there. And then I would love also, if we have the time, Brenda and John, what would the implications?
Is that subliminal?
Oh, did I say something? It's Tourette's. What does it look like then in Oregon in terms of some of the major things in terms of how many STEM jobs exist under this classification in Oregon? Not the deeper dive into each county, I think. But that would be great. And then also wage information around that. I think that was a powerful piece of this. And then, 3. Okay.
Like
The other is the implications for the middle 40 around that. So how many of those STEM jobs that are available do not require 4-year degrees in Oregon? And I think that those 3 pieces of analysis would be
Can I
really
suggest a 4th?
beneficial. Sure. Yeah. If you're willing to join the small subgroup, you can.
I was just thinking outlook. What is the outlook of these?
Yeah. 'cause
Okay, the
a lot
outlook.
of
Yes,
this
the
is-
current and outlook. Yeah.
All right.
Thank
so
you.
I'll sign on to that.
Is that, and not that I'm trying to broaden, but it's more than just the middle 40, it also for the
Technical.
the high school.
Yeah.
People come out of high school,
Yeah.
they need certain technical competence, need something for that group too. Get them through high
Non-4-year.
school.
Non-4-year.
Non-4-year. Or non-2-year, well, the middle 40 is the 2-year, right? Grade, no, that's high school.
Or a
Certificate.
certificate.
Or
That's certificate, yeah, it's the middle 40. And the last 20, the first 20 is the high school, right? Just
Yeah,
high school.
yeah.
So it has some implications for high school too.
They probably
Yeah,
don't. I wonder
it
what they
does.
use to measure what educational attainment is.
So the small team, Brenda, John, probably myself, others.
Which one was it?
So can you reiterate the four things?
What was the
Implication of the 40, what the small team's gonna look at?
Sort of what these occupations end up looking like in Oregon if you take that appendix in and apply it to Oregon's occupational layout. The wages associated with those occupations, the educational demand or requirements, the formal educational requirements associated with that, and then the occupational outlook going forward to 2022.
Yeah, that's the analytical aspects. And
Right.
then there's some other things, such as the report of, does this make sense for us? And do we know what the implications for us would be in adopting that? Any negatively anticipated? Okay,
Sure.
great. That's fantastic. Chair, Lisa, did you have anything to add to that?
No, it sounds great. Thank you.
Okay, do we want to, given the time and wanting to get to what Chrissy has for us, I would suggest that we don't go into the classification of instructional program analysis right now. But I would love to see a Brookings-like report for the zip codes because they're binary right now as well. You know, they just they did what these other different taxonomies did for the jobs and apply it to the zip codes. But we know, again, a lot of the social sciences get left out, but many of the social sciences actually require a high degree of mathematics to be successful in them. So that study hasn't been done yet, so we probably need to just adopt for now some zip code definitions that enable us to move forward and to put that out to some institutional researchers or people who have worked in that field.
If we have the occupations defined within the state, then our analysts have already aligned them to all the zip codes locally and nationally. So that articulation would already be done by analysts if it's placed in the CIS environment. Because we've already got those linkages.
Did you want to open this conversation? You started that comment.
I started to say no. Well, if we can finish the conversation in 3 minutes, great. You know, in terms of if there's some steps that we could take to move forward, similarly to what we're doing with the Brookings, that would be great. Who else needs to be a part of that conversation to look at the zip codes?
Well, maybe I made it much bigger than it should be at this point, but I'm just saying that first step, that second step may be easier once that first step is done. I think it's a longer
Okay.
conversation, but some work in Oregon has already been done along those lines.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe if we could ask you to, using the Brookings, then to maybe come back about the implications around the zip codes?
I could.
Or if, yeah.
It'd probably have to be after, well, yeah, I need your assessment sheet.
Because Brookings has already done the classifications to the SOC.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where your crosswalk is already, right?
No,
No, it's
so
a
within
different-
CIS has articulated alignment between every single occupation, so every single SOC, and then the programs of study someone would go into
Right.
that would prepare them for that,
Okay.
if that makes sense. So it wouldn't be looking at the zip codes and analyzing the zip codes in and of themselves. Instead, it would be looking at how the occupations, people prepare to enter into those occupations, and then pulling the zip codes out from that.
Oh.
So it's looking at
engineering.
a, yes.
Yeah, reverse engineering. That would be lovely.
Wow, that's tricky.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're tricky.
Well, I mean, that's, so you'd be again sort of leveraging off of this
Absolutely.
work.
That would be great if we could do it like that.
Yeah.
It seems like the parallel to this is, we talked about STEM degrees, but degrees are sort of clunky agglomerations of
Yes.
of knowledge acquisition. You could have an English major with a math minor who
Yeah.
goes on to be a tremendously successful STEM occupant or employee of some sort. And so it's really that It's that STEM proficiency that you pick up. You don't have to have a whole degree to pick up
Yeah.
some pretty solid, and that's where I think we get hung up with the
it makes-
degrees.
Yeah, it is, it's
Although
not fine enough.
business people being quants.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a journalism undergrad, and I run an economic consulting firm that reports on numbers a lot.
But I
So-
think that calls into the critical nature of what the STEM hubs do and Marcia does, in that counseling students and helping students see how that can happen, because anytime you're going to come up with a taxonomy, there's always going to be limitations. You know,
Yeah, sure, yeah.
and so that people component is important. I mean, we're not looking at that here, but
Well, I think it's just an important implication down the road too.
Yeah.
If something's adopted, that we, think about the consequences to our field and messaging and all of that.
Right.
By what we go with.
And it's good to go into this with the limitations, understanding the limitations, that no decision is going to be perfect. There was always, John, I just learned, was a journalism undergrad, I was a music undergrad. These things happen and nothing.
These things happen to about 90% of the population.
That's right, and
Fisheries.
And so as we tried to do the alignment with the degrees or certificates to the jobs and the outcomes, there are going to be things that just are,
Okay.
just need to be aware that's there.
Okay. So let's pick that up in our next conversation then, with around the classifications with the SIPs. But I'll be thinking those people who have been more deeply involved with the SIPs and post-secondary classifications and understanding, those degree structures. Gwen, if you'd like to join us on that, that would be wonderful in that conversation there. And maybe pull from some of the other institutional researchers that we know that have a part of that conversation. Okay, so we'll do some offline conversation around that. What I'd love to do is to shift toward filling this subcommittee in on some of the work that's been happening with the STEM hubs to try to define a shared outcomes framework. The notion here is that how do we connect the outcomes of the work that is happening on the ground to the broader statewide goals and outcomes of the 40-40-20 and the OEIB's indicators and framework for success, their scorecard. And is there anything missing there that we need to be aware of? So again, the idea from where we're sitting is to engage the field and use the wisdom of practice of the field to inform policy and metrics and to co-construct that together, not just as the state we can sit here and go, oh, here's the outcomes, push that out. Well, we saw how well that worked with the achievement compacts. We need to reset that relationship so that people feel that these are things that they own and that they're having control over and that fits within a larger construct and framework that we're trying to accomplish as a state. So it is a discourse that's happening. So with that, I leave it to Dr. Hewitt.
While we're sharing, I used to be a biologist, then I became a science education researcher, and now I'm a state official. That's my weird path. So Mark gave a great introduction into the work we've been doing with the STEM hubs and the Education Policy Improvement Center and our research and policy team at the OEIB. So I'm not going to go through a lot of background on the collaboratives, but I just thought for everyone's benefit, I'd just give a quick overview of Oregon's regional collaboratives. So we have the regional achievement collaboratives, the STEM hubs, and the early learning hubs, and really they're founded on the idea of multi-sector collaboration, which is where we get the term collaboratives. This means, they're basically partnerships coming from industry, K-12, universities, nonprofits, so multiple sectors coming together to address a common issue. So really it's founded on a collective impact model for community change, but we're talking about it in the frame of multi-sector collaboration, mainly because we're not trying to brand any one person and any one group into adopting a collective impact framework necessarily, but this is what it's built upon. Well, more with the STEM hubs and the recs. There's some trickiness because of the uniqueness of some of the groups and things that are going on in the state.
What we wanted for the STEM hubs was the functionality without the jargon.
Yeah.
So that the pillars of collective impact are sound.
Yeah.
We've seen initiatives across the country who adopt a collective impact approach and pay attention to the structures without actually achieving the goals of collective impact, and they get twisted over definitions and whatnot. So we think that these elements are really critical to pay attention to, but the jargon is not.
Yeah, and so we've created our own jargon by saying multi-sector collaboration.
Yes,
but
we
can define that on the top of our
Yeah,
pages.
yeah.
So right, they all have these 5 elements: common agenda, shared measurement system, reinforcing activities, continuous communication, and this backbone support. And really what we're talking about with the outcomes is a lot of the measurement piece. So if you click forward one. So again, here's kind of a funky schematic of a STEM hub pulling together all these different sectors. And really in thinking about shared measurement, if we have some common outcomes that we can look at a systems level, we could do a few different things that we can't do if we don't coordinate. So we can share tools and resources within and across regions, right? So that not each hub is left on their own to come up with all sorts of things to measure the outcomes. It's also hopefully going to give us a view of systems level change, right? So not what is happening with one hub, but what is happening, as a system. And then, ongoing learning related to hub efficiency and effectiveness. So when we have some common language and we have some ways to align and think about the change that the hubs are actually seeking and how that aligns to what's happening at a state level, I think it's going to propel us forward. So, and then shared here is obviously italicized. Mark mentioned this is really something that we're trying to work with multiple people with the field, and Jerry Ann's been working with us, and Joe, and all the other folks from the hubs. So.
And each of the hubs are at a different place in this. So part of the challenge is that partnerships are localized, right? So how do we help provide the necessary assistance and vision and support for them to elevate to be about, from a state level, it's really about an economic prosperity initiative that exists for the state, for communities, and for individuals. And so it should really be from birth through to career. Now, partnerships have developed in different communities around different things. In Medford, it's all economic development. That's their driving force. In other places, it's been started from a history of math-science partnerships, really focused around the K-12. So our task at hand is to honor what has been started and to help build from the positive work that's already been happening, but then also to help stretch and engage around issues related to equity in terms of issues in regard to the economic and workforce needs in their communities, etc. So that's an ongoing work that needs to happen.
So question. One of the biggest leverage points obviously is the school systems in those STEM hubs. Do you have success stories on where they've been able to see the school system change the way they're approaching the education system yet? That's a big lift in my mind, because that's ultimately the way we've been talking about is the educational experience has to change for students to
In
have.
November, we had a meeting about data and outcomes where we discussed some successes, early successes that the partnerships thought they had. But maybe Joe, I'll let you pipe in on this.
Last week, I got an email from Tracy Cruz, the project coordinator in the Oregon coast. They've been going around doing some town hall type meetings and professional developments. She has had teachers tell her that the teachers have changed their practice and seen their school districts change policy because of work from the hubs.
That's fantastic. That's really great
So,
to hear.
I have asked for details.
That's what I was saying.
I asked for details. So
But-
part of the
yeah.
idea behind this whole framework is to say, here's a systemic look at what we're doing with the hubs, what the STEM Investment Council is behind. And then also, you know, when you go in to report to the legislator, you have a nice concurrent framework, but then also those stories behind it that we're working on with Epic and Joe and other folks to collect those so that that can be brought forward.
That's fantastic.
And with the Portland Metro partnership,
Yeah.
we're actually seeing districts influencing each other in the works. So we work with three of the largest in Forest Grove, so we're seeing how work that Beaverton is doing, Hillsborough is picking up on. And it's because of the work of the partnership and supporting their efforts.
That's great. I mean, that's really meaningful information, don't you? You say the return on the investment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and even challenges, right? So we want to pull up what are the partnerships struggling with?
Right.
What can we do to move forward? And that's part of this whole cycle here, planning and studying and seeing so we can act upon it before the investment's done and we realize what we didn't do right at the end.
Yeah.
So, just a brief overview of how we're thinking about selecting outcomes. So what we did was from a November data and outcome meeting and from working with the STEM hubs. A lot of them have their own individual logic models and all their own individual local outcomes that their partnerships have agreed upon. So what we tried to do is really crosswalk those and overlap them and pull from what they were already doing and what they were already seeing as outcomes that they wanted to affect. We also made sure we brought in the legislative requirements, right? Because we do have things that we're responsible for by law. And then, you know, things from the investments from the original RFP, the partnership plan, and then also getting more at kind of the partnership effectiveness. That hub infrastructure is really the evidence-based practices regarding some effective partnership measures. Because as Mark mentioned, they're all in different places of development, and if you can see early wins on how the partnership is developing, that gives you more of a clue that you're going to be effective down the road versus, you know, they just started, where's your student outcome? We've had the money for 6 months, you know, is not. So in that way, that's almost some of the more early outcomes that we can look at.
Yeah. Just getting the right representation at the table to have the conversation is a big win. So, you know, are underrepresented communities part of the conversation? You know, is there business and industry as part of the conversation? Are the workforce folks and economic development folks at the table? Do you have engagement by the post-secondary institutions? Which ones? At what level? All of them or just some of them? You know, are superintendents, you know, engaged in this? Are out-of-school time providers also having a voice? So those are some of the organizational things. Are people still coming to meetings? You know, are they engaged?
Yeah.
What level of commitment have they made? Are you seeing change? Do you have structures in place to actually monitor your own change and make adjustments? There's a whole bunch of things that the partnerships themselves need to be asking themselves about their effectiveness.
And along those same lines, you know, we recognize with the system support section that there are things at the state level that, you know, peer-to-peer learning networks, you know, so it's on the back of this sheet if you're interested in the bottom systems level supports. We can thinking of what is the OEIB doing, what is the state doing to enable those conditions for the hubs to actually be successful, so that we're accountable for, you know,
So
and the STEM Investment Council.
So the money that
Sorry.
the money they've been allocated, is that used mostly for just infrastructure and creating the environment, or are they actually designing programs too that are trying to push out into this? They're doing both, okay.
Right?
Yeah.
They are doing both in the hope that at some point, some of these programs can kind of be set free to a partner.
Right.
So it's more piloting and tool development and connecting.
Well,
So
and I
they're
think-
acting as a true backbone.
Well, and it would depend on your region. If you already have a lot of STEM things going on and you can just be that connector, it would be different as if you were in a place where there's not a lot of opportunities already, that you might need to build some of that programming.
Right.
So anyways, a question that we've gotten a lot from the hubs is, you know, but does this mean these are the outcomes that we have to look at, or the only ones we have to look at? And the idea here is to whittle this down into a list that's manageable, that we can look at a systems level and not to supplant local outcomes, because what we're doing is a really high level picture of how we're achieving change and not telling local communities how they're necessarily building their strategies to achieve that. I mean, we can provide some insights and things that we think would be effective, but that's not the goal, is to make everybody do a one-size-fits-all.
Though we want them to be looking at those common
Yes.
outcomes so that they can say, oh, wow, maybe we should also be picking up on this. So it's a little bit of both,
It's a dance.
in that regard, so that they're looking at it from a systems perspective and not just a program level myopia that often sets in and says, oh, well, we changed teachers' attitudes, so we're done. And that's really disingenuous there. I'm sorry about that. That they are also attending to other aspects of the system in their work. at
Well,
least
and
thinking
keeping
about
their
it.
eyes open for, these are the indicators we'll see in
Right.
4 years, these are the indicators we could
Right.
see in 6, or all
Yeah.
our strategies are aimed at what's happening 3 years out, maybe we need to put things in line for 6 years out too.
Or more closely.
Yes.
So
or more
some,
closely, yes.
who adopt the, oh, we're going to change, student achievement scores. Well, wow, good on you, but you're not going to see that in a biennium. So you do need to change teachers' attitudes about how they teach first, and you could see change. It just needs to be linked to the longer term.
So if you could switch to the next one. So we've been working with the hubs, with the Education Policy Improvement Center to pull together drafts of these outcomes. I'll say this is a very nice, pretty picture that we've commissioned through them that is a draft. All of these are changeable, wording is changeable, and we really would like feedback on all of this. But we really wanted to see, for an example, for student outcomes and then the workforce at the end, how we were spanning across the continuum, and do we have systems level indicators across the continuum, and do we have too many, and at which points would we measure these? Those are all, a lot of those are further down the road conversations, because we have to define all these, we have to have the indicators and metrics, and then we have to think about how overwhelming that might be. So anyways, this is where we are. And as you can see, we're going all the way from birth to workforce, and so we're continually getting feedback on this. This, along with the list that you see here, is kind of the newest version that'll be pushed out to the field. It's a constant work in progress. We're trying to go as slow as possible while also thinking about legislative updates.
As slow as possible.
And I really want, Jerry
That's right.
has input, she's been working
She's been
alongside us,
fantastic,
So I thought this was fantastic. My only comment was, and I think maybe it's a level below this, but in many of these areas, I think we have to address the equity issues in many places. And not only rural children of poverty, and children of color, so that in each of these swim lanes, if you will, we can track each of those, because in many areas there's disproportionately results, and we don't want to look at the whole level and say we're doing fine when in fact we haven't brought up the bottom. And so I think it's important that it be clear that there's an equity lens across all this that we have to watch, as well as a rural perspective, because those people tend to get left out of the conversation, and we think, oh, we did a great job, but we haven't brought up the bottom. And I think that's important to legislate.
What's not on this one
Yeah.
that was on a previous version was a pretty, I think, a fairly strong stance on the equity.
Oh, sorry, yes, that will
Yeah.
be, so I'll have a
We
further
need to
document,
incorporate
was,
that.
we have kind of a rationale, and then we'll have the framework, the outcomes, some pieces in, and sort of not a true legislative interim report, but a report that we're going to,
And that all of
Use
these
for
data
that, yeah.
would be disaggregated
It's great.
by
Right.
gender, by race,
Mhm.
by socioeconomic status, wherever possible.
This may, this is a very wonderful, I really like it, but I wonder if you couldn't add a little arrow that went from the workforce back to post-secondary and talked about reskilling. And I think that fits into Mark's,
Yeah.
some of the things talking about those, as those.
In common.
I like that.
Yeah.
Excellent, that's really wonderful.
Yep, I think you're absolutely right.
Because
That's
the knowledge
wonderful.
how to reskill, I think, is a critical
That's-
factor that we need to teach early on that sometimes we miss. So that when students step out or leave the
Oh, I
off-ramp
think
of
that's-
education, they don't know how to
great.
get back
I
on.
think that's great, and I think I'd be interested in talking further about a potential outcome on that line, like how to phrase
Well, that's really the
that.
education plan and profile. That's really, in my opinion, what
Yeah.
it's trying to teach, that career self-management skill, how to make a decision, how to set a goal.
Continuous learning.
Well, it's beyond just reskilling, it's current skilling. I mean, industry needs to
Right.
continue to feedback in the system, and that's what the hubs are trying to do, is say, here's the skills and knowledge we need to be competitive as business. It needs to fit into the system. We're not just trying to guess at what the workforce needs. We're trying to be reactionary to what they need.
Right, and thinking about it from the university or community college perspective, so much of the enrollment, right? So much of what they do, so much of our degree production, so much of our certificate production is precisely these people who are cycling back in. So I think that catch is really important for
And
the
I think
demographic.
it's something, I don't know if you and Jim can comment on this, but, you know, we always talk about, what about the adult learners? But then it's like 40-40-20 is focused really highly on 2025 and those people that are kind of coming out of the system now and not so much
Yeah.
the people, I mean, that's my understanding.
Well, the
maybe
HECS,
that's
the HECS
salacious, but-
conversation has evolved substantially over the
Yeah.
last year from a pipeline
Yeah.
metaphor to really
Yeah.
better understanding that there's an incumbent workforce that also needs to be included into this conversation. And so I think that they're really broadening that, particularly since our community colleges, there's only, 11% of the students come directly from high school to them. All the rest have been out for 2 or more years before they come into the community college system. So we need to capture that for sure.
Yeah.
There's also a whole set of education that occurs in apprentice programs and
Yep.
industry too, that
Exactly.
we just don't show up, workers just don't show up there and they're done. There's a continuous loop within
Yeah,
the
that would be
workforce
really
for
interesting.
apprentice training and skills
Yeah.
training
A
and
lot
all
of the
those
apprentice
things.
training happens in concert with community colleges.
The new
Yeah,
metaphor I'm hearing is
certificate.
watershed
Yeah.
instead of
Pipeline.
It's watershed.
Watershed,
Yes.
yeah.
Watershed
wow,
or
watershed.
food network.
Shoreline.
That's another one.
Yeah.
Shoreline.
And that's interesting because it's not just the pathways, which is also a little bit limiting.
It's a
But
shoreline,
pipeline.
right? That's
Shoreline.
what, that's
It's
what,
a food.
Sam Henry.
It's an
Dr. Henry
ecosystem.
says it's a shoreline.
Sorry,
So
Don't
the,
tell Nancy I said
that. So, right, so we're really trying to get continuous input from the field and again, move it along so we can get legislative reports out, but also really take in feedback from the field and others. And then, you know, really, this is really complex and, you know, it takes a lot of time, it takes looking at multiple perspectives. We really want the outcomes to support this reflective improvement of partnerships. And one thing that we're really trying to do right now is get these outcomes down to those that are most informative at the systems level. But then also not dropping off outcomes that, you know, making sure that there are still local outcomes that move towards, you know, the overall strategies that, you know, maybe put forth in kind of the STEM Investment Council and those sorts of things. So, Seth?
Sorry.
That's okay.
The only thing I would add to that, and I think it's something Mark and I have talked a lot about, is how do you scale these things? I mean, it's great you come up with good ideas, but there's a real strategy on how you scale this to the whole state, and especially those areas. So that's I think, a big challenge is we find really good things that are happening. How do we make it more systemic?
Right.
And that's one of the central tenets of the STEM hubs, is to build an intellectual infrastructure
Network,
and
yeah.
network of networks,
Yeah.
a mesh of
Wow.
professionalism to exchange those so that we can spread the good ideas and spread the things that didn't work, because those are just as important as the things that do.
And thinking about capacity and measurement and all these
Yep.
things, once we have some outcomes that are shared, there's just a lot of opportunity for that sharing and peer-to-peer networks and tools and resources. So there's multiple contributions to this, you know, the STEM hubs, our research and policy team, Mark, of course, and the Education Policy Improvement Center and the folks at the OD. So we have 6 minutes for discussion. But I appreciate the discussion along the way.
Can I say that when I look at this, I see student outcomes, I see educator outcomes. I don't really see anything here on the district level, the building level. And if that effective learning environment
Like
is not
policy
in
level.
place, right, the local policy level,
I would say I bring it a little, yes, that's an important consideration, but where you really see challenges for changing school learning environments is the level of leadership.
Yeah.
And how that's defined in the district can be
Yeah.
important. And it needs to encompass both the building principal and the leadership team at the school level, but also the leadership approach and style and level at the district level. So, and that was one of the notes that I made, is that, because at an earlier version, you pointed out the need for administrative.
Oh,
yeah, we
administrative,
did.
yeah. Yeah.
Administrative
We did,
outcomes.
yeah.
Yeah, we'll circle back, make sure that we
Yeah.
haven't test-driven ethics work here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's an area
Yeah.
that is critical if we really want to see change at the classroom, school level.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, an effective teacher is just an isolated pocket of excellence.
No,
Yeah.
I agree.
Got tons of-
Oh, didn't we had put an asterisk on the first one. Administrator and leadership, but yeah, I think we should explore an outcome related to that.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to help.
John?
So the, I
A
guess,
comment from my role in OUS, educator outcomes, you know, our higher ed institutions are not perfect in educator outcomes in STEM either, right?
Yeah.
And what I believe that what we're going to be measuring eventually is STEM degrees and certificates. Lots of problems can happen to students once they get into our education, our higher education system. So I really suggest that we include some, you know, some lens on what's happening in terms of STEM education inside the colleges, NCTE, of course, eventually, inside the colleges and universities.
I really appreciate
Yeah,
that.
so when
comment.
we purposefully used educator to encompass classroom teachers in K-12 and early learning, to include administrators and principals, to include faculty as well, and the informal educators. So for us, educator encompasses, and maybe we should be much more specific about what we're talking about there, about who's included.
Well, I think some evidence that this is inclusive of post-secondary would be, you know, might be helpful, because a lot of the language, if you delve down to it, is K-12. It comes from K-12.
Okay.
It appears to read from more from a K-12
Okay.
lens.
Great.
I can definitely work with that. My focus was post-secondary.
Yeah, so any additional
Okay, so you
languages?
were thinking it, yeah.
Yeah, so if you've got some language where you think that it can be shift to make it broader, that would be great. And John, you?
well, I was just wondering what our specific role is relative to all of this, because this is a tremendous amount of work with a lot of people across the state working on it all at once. And are we supposed to, what are we doing with this? Are we to look at it, advise you?
Yes.
Validate
Yes.
advice.
Shape it or whatever,
Uh-huh.
but
Absolutely.
Okay.
And ultimately, this would be the committee that then makes the recommendation to the STEM Investment Council. Yes, we've vetted these, we've said, you know, here are metrics associated with these that we would want to, you know, but there's going to be a dynamic between the strategic planning subcommittee as well, right? So they're going to have goals and probably even some specific strategies that they want to be putting forward and articulating, and those then need to line up to these. So far, I think that there is going, you know, we're on the right pathway, so there'll be perhaps some tweaking.
Well, yeah, and as we move forward, right, so we need metrics and indicators for all of these, and if you'll see here, for the workforce outcomes, we have increased the number of Oregonians filling STEM-related jobs. That's part of, you know, how are we defining that? So all that work is, and suggestion of indicators in each of those pockets.
There's many ways that we can look at the workforce, and I would love the input. I mean, we could say, you know, the amount of imported talent that Oregon provides across different degree structures, right? We could look at wage earning, differential wage earnings that happen there. We can look at, you know, the time to fill these STEM jobs, as we just defined from Brookings Institute, in order to find high weight or high demand for the purposes of feeding into the HEX funding formula. So there's a number of different threads here. Right now, our most immediate thing would be to say, you know, are we on the right track? Are there things that are missing from here? Are there challenges or problems with any of these? And you know, from given your different lenses in this work.
Yeah, like the
Do you want us to just
post-secondary.
email you?
Yeah, that would be great. And you had you've already given us great, but continue to give us that feedback, yes.
Yeah, one comment I would have, and that's always a challenge, is many of these are lagging indicators, or kind of after the fact you're measuring. So some are leading indicators, and being clear on what you're leading and lagging, so you can see the correlation between those is really important.
Well, and I think some of the struggle too is when you want to define a lot of the short-term indicators,
Yeah.
it starts to get at the strategies of the individual hubs. And
Yeah.
so that's something that we're continually struggling and kind of dancing with.
And we believe that some of the leading indicators are shifts in both awareness of career awareness, interest in STEM, as evidenced by perhaps 9th grade elective choices. I mean, there's a number of different things that we can look at as leading indicators. The ACT and what people express on the ACT. I don't know to what extent that actually is a leading indicator, but I mean, a valuable leading indicator. It is a leading indicator, but to what extent it actually then translates into taking that. So there's a number of other places.
Do we
that
have
can
data?
do that.
Are these ones we could measure systems wide? All those things
Yeah.
are going to start pouring out.
That's great.
So please
So,
email
so
us.
Mark, this is Lisa. I apologize for jumping in, but I am noticing the time.
Yep.
Okay.
Is it a good opportunity to wrap up next steps? And
Yeah, I think we do a very, very quick wrap. Next step is the meeting of the smaller working group here. Then there's also a group around the SIP-SOC, and then feedback on these proposed outcomes that have been put forward here.
And knowing that things are coming, metrics, definitions, and as we go along the way, we can send those out.
Okay. Anything to add to that, Lisa?
no, I think that's a great list of items to focus on.
Okay. Thank you all. I know it's
Good
10,
meeting.
11:30.
It's a good meeting.
I think we've advanced a lot of stuff today, particularly with the Brooklyn. That's good.
Great.
Okay, thank you so much.